starting our Chapter 4 PowerPoint. Chapter 4 is about how we became a territory and then a state. When we finished talking about Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, we had talked about how we had removed the Native Mississippians here through the Indian Removal Act and the Trail of Tears, and we started to have Spanish and French explorers come and start establishing settlements and forts. So this is just talking about what we looked like once all of that happened. So at first, the territory's capital was in Natchez, but it was debated that it was just too far out, so they moved it more central into Washington. And Washington did well, and the population grew to about 1,000 people. We also established some colleges. In 1802, Jefferson College became our first state-supported college, so we started to have public education. The most famous person to attend Jefferson College was actually Jefferson Davis. And some historians consider Elizabeth Female Academy to be the first college for females in the nation, so we also had Elizabeth Female Academy established. And this is what colleges looked like back then. This was Jefferson College. A lot different from what it looks like today. The two main routes in Mississippi Territory to transport things on and to just travel down were the Mississippi River and the Natchez Trace. And the Natchez Trace actually had the nickname of the Devil's Backbone because it was just full of bandits and it was sort of dangerous to go down. As far as the river was concerned, we didn't have boats with motors and things like that. So our boats just went based off of the speed of the river, and we could only go downstream, not up. So the boat would be moving along very slowly, which made it easy for robbers to jump onto the boats and steal things. And obviously, the robbers and river pirates were dealt with, and a jailhouse was built. And then in 1801, the Natchez Trace was actually made an official mail route. Therefore, it was made much safer. Because mail is controlled by the government and stuff like that, they had to protect it and police the trace so that the mail was safe, because important documents would be being sent and they couldn't be stolen. President Thomas Jefferson, at the time of the United States, asked to purchase New Orleans from France, and the guy that was in charge in France was Napoleon. And Napoleon actually ended up offering Jefferson an entire territory for 3 cents an acre. And Jefferson obviously agreed to that deal, so the purchase doubled the size of the United States. And in 1803, the Louisiana Territory was officially transferred to the United States. So if you look at this map, our United States was just this area. These were the only established states, and we had some territories here, obviously our territory. But then this area right here was the Louisiana Purchase. So that doubled the size of the United States. The United States went from just being over here in some territory to all of this, just for 3 cents an acre. Once all of that land was bought, there were more people that needed to be, I guess you can say, removed. The War of 1812 was between France and England, but to Mississippians, it was a war between Indians and American settlers. So the British were making alliances with the Indian nations, telling them that they could have their land back as soon as they helped them defeat the United States from taking over that territory. So the Creek Nation started attacking white settlements, and it just caused panic. So General Andrew Jackson was ordered to attack the Creeks. But the white people actually abandoned the settlements and gathered at the home of Samuel Mims, which turned into Fort Mims. And then in 1813, a group of Creek Indians actually attacked Fort Mims, and all but 36 of the people there were killed. And a woman who was a slave, was wounded, but she managed to escape, and she went down the Mobile River in a canoe and paddled until she got to the next closest fort to warn the soldiers about the Creek attack. So once they had the warning, they were able to defeat them at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And in the treaty, which made Andrew Jackson win, the Creeks gave up 23 million acres of land to the United States. So once that was dealt with, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend ended, the Creeks' participation in the war, and General Jackson was sent to New Orleans to protect that area from British invasion. And although the Americans won the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, the war had already been over. They just hadn't been informed of that, so they fought for no reason, really. But victory there still helped Andrew Jackson win the presidential election several years later. So once all that territory was settled and we had the Louisiana Purchase, everything started to get more populated, and it just skyrocketed, the population. So when our territory grew so much in population, we became eligible for statehood. So we were admitted to the United States on December 10th, 1817. And we drafted our own little constitution called the Constitution of 1817. And in that constitution, it basically said you had to own property in order to be in charge. So because you had to own property to be like in charge and be a political leader, only wealthy white men controlled the state before the Civil War occurred. So now that we were a state, we needed to do some internal improvements. Internal improvements refers to like building roads and bridges and canals and all these things, because our most abundant resource was land, and in order to use it, we had to be able to get to it. So we had to build ways to get across our state. And in order to do that, we needed to have money. So when all this started happening, we started making roads and things, we decided we needed to move our capital again. So in 1821, a committee met, and they chose LaFleur's Bluff on the Pearl River, and they named the capital Jackson in honor of General Andrew Jackson. And they met for the first time in December 1822 at the new governor's mansion in the new capital. They built this. The architect was William Nichols, built a beautiful building for them to meet in. During all of this, politically, we had some issues going on. There were allegiances to local governments and interests rather than national. Like instead of dealing with the United States as a whole, people were more worried about themselves. Each state's senators favored policies that were good for their own community and didn't really care about the other state's needs. So, for example, protective tariffs and slavery were the main causes of the sectionalism. And what that was protective tariffs helped the northeastern states by adding tax on goods from other countries so that Americans would buy mostly American-made goods. But it didn't help the South because it made them have to raise the price of their crops, which made them not make as much money. And in the South, slaves were the primary labor force, while in the Northeast, it was working white-class men. So slavery was a huge issue and a controversial topic, which caused more sectionalism. So in 1832, we passed our new constitution, our second constitution. The 1817 constitution was just outdated. So people met, and the new constitution removed the land ownership requirements from elected officials and allowed judges to be elected rather than appointed. So the new constitution still allowed slavery, but now it wasn't just wealthy white men that were in charge, which caused for rallies, political rallies. The two main parties in Mississippi back then were the Whigs and Democrats. So these rallies were just people standing on tree stumps yelling back and forth at each other, basically, and bickering. And sometimes it would go so violent, people would shoot each other, and people could be injured or killed during these rallies. We were rich, basically, at this time. We used the land, population grew, and farming just started to occur. We had, again, our most abundant natural resource was land, and we were making money off of it. We had banks established to help farmers buy land, slaves, and farming equipment. And many people established cotton plantations, and they were starting to make a lot of money off of cotton. Cotton was known as king cotton. It was the state's dependent crop. The technological developments increased the demand for cotton from the southern plantations, like the cotton gin and the factories in the north. So cotton could make plantation owners rich in just a few years. So a lot of people just abandoned growing anything else and only grew cotton. And it made people very, very wealthy. And had a lot of people reliant on the cotton. So a lot of people supported slavery because they thought that the only way to keep up with the demand for cotton was through slave labor. So once slavery started becoming even more important in the South, it got more controversial to the people in the Northeast area. So the Missouri Compromise had to be passed. We were starting to bicker. There was a lot of sectionalism. So the nation was concerned about the possibility of slavery moving to the new territories. We had all of these states established, but we had this territory up here from Louisiana Purchase that had not yet been broken up into states. So it was agreed in the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that the states south of this line right here would have slaves and the ones north of it would not. And for each slave state that was admitted to the United States, to the Union, there was a non-slave state also admitted to keep the balance between those types of states. So they were trying to split the power, and if a slave state was admitted down here, a free state would be admitted up here, just to try and keep the peace for as long as possible. However, that was not a permanent solution. So they tried another compromise. When California was admitted, it was the Compromise of 1850. But there was just more arguments with that as well. Soon the South began thinking about the possibility of seceding to form their own country where slavery was protected by law. So then Texas came about, and Texas got its independence from Mexico and asked to join the United States. Annexation means to join the United States. So Texas wanted to annex the United States. Most Texans were Southerners, however, and they took their slaves with them to plant cotton. And Texas was so large that some people even said it should be 5 states, not just one, which the Northerners did not like because that meant that 5 new slave states would be admitted into the Union, which would tip the scales in favor of slave states. So for 10 years, Texas was a national issue. And in 1845, both Florida and Texas were admitted as slave states. So to balance that, in 1846, Iowa and Wisconsin were admitted to balance the scale as free states. The Mexican War then occurred. The United States and Mexico went to war a year after Texas left because Mexico didn't recognize Texas's independence. So Mississippi sent 2 regiments to fight in the war with Texas, but the Treaty of Guadalupe ended the war. It wasn't too long. 1848 ended the war. So the United States gained what is now New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California under that treaty. So we got even more land. So again, more land, more issues with slave versus free. So Wilmot Proviso in 1846. The Mexican War was unpopular in the North, but popular in the South. So abolitionists, which were people who were against slavery in the North, believed the admissions of the territories would be used to tip the political power in favor of slave states. So Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot introduced a bill that would exclude slavery from any territory obtained from Mexico, but sadly the law was not passed. So Southerners became angry, and by 1848 they were talking about the formation of a new Southern nation again. Then the California territory grew rapidly during the gold rush. There was gold found in California, and everyone went there, so they started to become eligible for statehood. But it wasn't that simple because they had to decide whether they would be free or a slave state. So a group of prominent Mississippians met in May of 1849 to discuss the disagreements between the North and the South. And the major issues were the admission of California and Southern slave owners' right to expand slavery into the new territory. So from those meetings, several pro-states sent delegates to a convention in Nashville. The Nashville Convention met, and the Compromise of 1850 was passed to help ease the tension that was going on between the free and slave states. And it also polarized Mississippi. A special election was held by the state to determine how people felt about slavery, and the Union won, and Henry Foote was elected governor. And also during 1851, a convention met to discuss the potential secession of the state. Mississippi delegates declared that the Mississippians should abide by the Compromise of 1850 whether or not they agreed. They also said that if the citizens and political leaders of Mississippi did not straighten up, the secession from the United States might be a forced one. So once all this started happening, a group of pro-slave speakers began to make inflammatory speeches throughout the South. The speakers convinced citizens that if they didn't keep slavery, they could not maintain their way of life. And they became known as fire eaters, and they had a lot of people fired up about seceding from the Union. The Kansas-Nebraska Act created the Nebraska and Kansas territories. It was decided that in these territories, whether they had slavery or not, would not come down to the vote of those who lived there. So free states didn't like that law because it led to the expansion of slavery. The North and the South both realized how important Kansas was, so many began to move there, and the settlement was bloody. There was also an extreme court case that happened in 1857, Dred Scott versus Stanford. Dred Scott was taken by his owner into a non-slave state. So he lived in a slave state with his owner and then was moved to a non-slave state. And his owner died when that happened. So an abolitionist, a person against slavery, encouraged Dred Scott to file a suit with a federal court and argue that because he was brought to a free state, he was free. However, the Supreme Court ruled he was property of the man, and because he was property, his owner could have taken him wherever he wanted to, and Scott would not be considered free. So the case basically made it so that the only way slavery would be abolished was by amending the Constitution of 1832, which was not going to happen anytime soon. So John Brown stepped up. October 16th, 1859, John Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He was trying to gather enough weapons to start a slave revolt, but he ended up getting caught, tried, convicted, and executed. And while he did not fully achieve his goal, he did make a lot of Southerners worried because a slave revolt was possible, and the fact that a white man tried to lead them to that revolt made them feel like they were in danger. So after that, Americans were They were done with it. They believed the only way the issue of slavery could be solved was war between two halves of the country, and there was no middle ground at all. So people in every part of the country were forced to choose a side, either the North or the South. And Mississippi seceded from the Union.